Now I continue dealing with the matter of the one world government, the establishment of the one world government using the guise and the ruse of environmentalism, saving the environment from greenhouse gases. The framework that the United Nations is pushing is called UN Agenda 2030. And even though Mr. Trump was elected in the deep state, that's part of the problem with our government now in the United States, is the deep state, the bureaucratic government operates outside the area of the Constitution. These alphabet soup named agencies, all these federal agencies, none of the individuals in those agencies are elected by us. We don't know who they are, and therefore they are unaccountable to the electorate. Under the agreement, the EPA and UNEP agree to cooperate on a broad range of initiatives. Among the areas where the two vow to work together with governments around the world is the implementation of the United Nations environmental agreements, including the changing and enforcing of laws, regulations to meet the United Nations demands. The scheme also calls for working together on education, including on climate change. No doubt the signatories intended to promote the discredited UN-backed hypothesis that human emissions of CO2, which account for a fraction of 1% of all greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, were driving catastrophic global warming. Indeed, among the actions to be taken by the MOU is responding to climate change, quote unquote, by cooperating on reducing energy use and emissions of CO2, an essential gas exhaled by humans that is known to many scientists as the gas of life. I mentioned as I left the program yesterday that if you remove the CO2 from the atmosphere, then all of the vegetation dies. And yet CO2 has been identified by our EPA as a poison. Well, now, the fact of the matter is I can't breathe CO2, but the trees certainly do. And the trees don't breathe oxygen. They give off oxygen, and you and I breathe that. This convoluted idea of man-made anthropogenic global warming, and we've got to get all the carbon out of the atmosphere. I have read after scientists now that are saying that we are dangerously low on the area of CO2 now. Anybody that owns a greenhouse or that knows anything about a greenhouse knows that whenever the vegetation inside that greenhouse becomes a bit lethargic and anemic, that you can back an automobile up and run the exhaust, non-catalytic converter exhaust inside that greenhouse. And now I know that carbon dioxide will make your eyes water. You can't breathe it. But then I don't breathe what a fish breathes either. But the vegetation certainly likes it, and it'll perk right up. The vegetation will perk right up, or they'll put a kerosene heater in there, and it'll give off gas and carbon, and that'll cause the vegetation to perk up. The agreement purports to commit the EPA and the United States taxpayers to fund it to help the UNEP and other governments transitioning to a green economy. That specific clause calls on the EPA and the United Nations to promote UN programs such as the 10-year framework of programs, a Marxist-style global scheme that aims to use government to make production and consumption sustainable, as mandated under Agenda 2030. Obviously, the only way to do that is through government control of consumption and production. The very essence of communism You can only do this, you can only grow so much, you can only consume so much. The entire sustainable development, quote unquote, agenda is totalitarian to the core, calling for government control over every aspect of human life, even control for your mind. A 2014 report on the green economy by the United Nations claims that everyone must, quote, alter their worldview profoundly and dramatically, end quote. A separate UN report entitled Working Towards a Balanced and Inclusive Green Economy, the United Nations system-wide perspective went even further. Transitioning to a green economy requires a fundamental shift in the way we think and act. It was not immediately clear how the EPA under the Trump administration was dealing with the MOU, but according to the terms of the scheme and an official at the agency who emailed the New American, it will remain in force for 5 years from the date it was signed, with the option to extend it at any point prior to its expiration. The EPA acknowledged receipt of questions from the New American, including a question on whether the scheme was still in force under President Trump. The agency did not offer much in the way of answers, only saying that it was still active while referring questions on substance to other bureaucracies. Property rights watchdog Tom DeWeese, president of the Liberty-Minded American Policy Center, stated that the United Nations EPA agreement is a threat to America. This MOU is part of the globalization of our own government, said DeWeese, the author of a new book, Sustainable: The War on Free Enterprise, Private Property, and Individuals. It clearly demonstrates the hidden inner workings of our government agencies with United Nations agencies and why it is so dangerous. The EPA is part of a United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, Permanent Council of Government Agencies that meet behind closed doors, creating policy and agreements that are not presented to or approved by our elected Congress. This is the standard operating procedure used by the United Nations and its globalist agents to avoid our Constitution. For them, our founding document is just a troublesome nuisance. Even as President Trump walks away from the Paris Climate Accord with this MOU in place, the EPA has still agreed to its basic implementation. Then there is Agenda 21, and I run into this all along in the real estate industry. Before Agenda 2030, there was a United Nations Agenda 21, the global body's first publicly released global plan to total reorganization and a regiment of every aspect of human life under a planetary regime. Naturally, as with Agenda 2030, the United States federal government has played a key role in imposing it on America and the world. Literally everything from education, labor, health care to oceans, agriculture, and the environment falls under the purview of this United Nations scheme. And in their own documents, the globalists behind Agenda 21 were remarkably transparent about the scope of the plan. In Agenda 21, the Earth Summit strategy to save our planet, one of the public versions of the plan, designated for a broad audience after the United Nations 1992 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. I followed that back in 1992 very closely. The globalists laid it all out. Agenda 21 proposes an array of actions which are intended to be implemented by every person on earth, quote unquote. The document reads, calling for specific changes in the activities of all people. Effective execution of Agenda 21 will require a profound reorientation of all human society, unlike anything the world has ever experienced. A major shift in the priorities of both governments and individuals, and an unprecedented redeployment of human and financial resources, quote unquote, continues the document. This shift will demand that a concern for the environmental consequence of every human action be integrated into individual and collective decision making at every level. Now, my time has gotten away from me on the Bright Spot Hour today. The Lord willing, we will continue with this on the program tomorrow.
Greenville, South Carolina 29602. Visit the website at thebrightspothour.com.